issues there. Like, one, how do you build Silicon Valley, and two, how do you build something like Y Combinator? And Y Combinator itself was already in Silicon Valley, so it already had the infrastructure. And a good story here is, I think when Y Combinator first started, it used to alternate between Boston and Silicon Valley, but then shut down the Boston program. And a large part of the reason was that Boston just didn't have enough of an ecosystem, like there weren't enough angel investors to actually get something like make the Y Combinator program work. So one, it's just important, Y Combinator benefit from being in the valley and already having that infrastructure, but in terms of how do you go about creating it, I think I don't think there's no shortcuts to it. I mean, it's like Valley has evolved over decades of people. For the most part, I think early stage capital is possibly the single most important thing. Like, there's no doubt. A lot of areas have very smart engineers and people who would start money if they could just get access to the first amount. And I think in a lot of startup ecosystems, and I've been traveling a lot recently and just observed this in various places. There's never any shortage of venture capitalists who are willing to invest in companies once they're up and running with revenue, but there's always generally a shortage of angel investors who are willing to write the first check before anyone else has done anything. And so that's like the number one thing. I think is you have to convince either people who have made their money in technology, people like Rajesh who understand the industry and want to give back to it, or you have to find a way to convince, and this is actually something that's happened in New York, in America, where I think people with finance backgrounds who typically wouldn't have thought of investing in startups have started looking towards startups as a potential asset class to invest in, and that actually I think has pushed New York to being the number two ecosystem in America. Does that answer the question? I think one thing that everyone tends to forget is, and with most things that are successful, is Y Combinator wasn't an overnight success. It was first, I think the very first batch was 2005, so it's been, 8 years? And it's taken a long time for Y Combinator to sort of evolve and figure out exactly the right model, and it's still learning. The way I view it is that these accelerators, generally the ones that I'm seeing, are investing fairly small amounts of money, and it's not as though they're going to cause some huge crater if they don't work out financially. So I'm not sure. What I do worry about though is that I think generally investors fall into three categories. There are the ones who add value, and Y Combinator falls into that class. There's the ones that are sort of just neutral, where they give you capital, but there's nothing else, which is totally fine. But then I think the worst type is obviously the ones that actually detract, and so sometimes you just have to be careful that the investors you're working with aren't actually going to draw you back or slow you down in some way by either offering bad advice. And I think sometimes these accelerated things attract people who are more attracted by the idea of running accelerators than they are by like producing great companies. So just have to be careful. Various things that Y Combinator looks for. I would say that the number one thing is obviously the people, and by that I mean people who seem determined, people who also have a good relationship with the co-founder. So ideally, the people they're starting the company with, they've known for a while. We do also, although ideas change, we do sort of pay attention to that, and seeing how people think through ideas, seeing people who actually what we really like to see are people who are sort of domain experts. So it's much better, rather than someone coming and pitching an idea for a photography startup having never taken a picture in their lives. It's much better if someone says, I've been working as a photographer for the last 10 years and I've seen a large amount of pain in storage of photos, or someone who worked at a company developing database software who realizes there's a new way of doing it. So that's what we look for: determination, good co-founders, and sort of domain expertise. Maybe the founders just lost motivation, maybe they decided that they weren't as passionate about the idea as they thought they were, and they'll go and join another Y Combinator startup, and that happens a lot. And as the Y Combinator network's grown, there's now options for sort of all different stages. Like if you decide actually you don't really enjoy working in a really small startup, you want to join something a bit bigger, you have Dropbox and Airbnb. If you decide actually you really enjoy working in a startup, but you don't want to be the founder, where you can go be employee number 1 or 2 at any variety of startups. And I think that recycling of talent is what makes Y Combinator strong, but also just Silicon Valley in general. Failure isn't a big deal because, in particular, I would also say, in particular, if you're an engineer, you'll always be able to command a good salary because there's just such a shortage of good engineers going around. So failure isn't really seen as it's just not seen as a big deal. Depending on how you handle it, by the way, there's different kinds of failure, right? There's failing because you gave it your best and it didn't work out, and there's failing because you are spending company money on a luxury mansion and you burn through all of your cash. It's a different sort of failure. It's a difficult question because in some senses you could argue, if you argue is success defined as a company worth over $1 billion, well then there's only there's a handful of them. If you define success as a company that is still alive, which is probably the more accurate way of doing it, then I don't know the exact numbers, but YC has a surprisingly low number of companies that just outright fail, I think. Or sort of just go under. But if I don't really want to quote a number, I'm not sure.